Thank you, Abigail and Marianne. I've got to discipline myself and stand in front of the microphone, I think, so I hope I will get this right. I'm going to have to rattle quite quickly because I'm going to try and cover around about 900 years of history and embrace the polite as well as the vernacular. I want to give you a sense, really, a sort of overview of the development of window forms over that period, and also a sense of the significance of the sort of physical artifacts that remain from those various periods of our building history. And I start with Hardwick Hall, a building which I suspect you all know, a building which has the distinction of having entered the canon of doggerel verse with this little rhyme, Hardwick Hall, more window than wall. I think it expresses, as well as any building, perhaps that conjunction in the late 16th century of new continental ideas about architectural forms and expression, and the availability in sufficient quantity and quality and at a reasonable cost of glass and a technology adequate for sealing these many windowed buildings against the inclement English weather, or is that inclement? So that combination of the material and technical with the cultural, I think, is what kind of gathers together the real significance of the window as an element of our building history, of course, but also as more widely a window onto the past, let's say. I'm going to try and give you a sense of the sort of fundamentals of window design, because I'm not sure how often we will revert to those. I'm going to tread very lightly on areas which will be covered in more detail by other members of our panel today. And I'm going to hopefully show you some interesting and alluring images of windows of various sorts. If we're talking about developments over time, we need to think about the reasons why things are changing over time. And I think in my list there, I've tried to summarize the main headings under which those contriving windows, whether as architects, designers, craftsmen, whatever, manufacturers, the ways in which they have striven to make more effective, more durable, and more aesthetically pleasing openings in buildings. And I emphasize at the bottom this kind of final category that the window is not simply a material artifact. It is a node or nexus of social activities, a convergence of various social activities. Again, a very, very basic point, and one that perhaps everyone in this room hardly needs to have restated, but I think it's worth giving it as a sort of starting position. And this is about the impact of windows on the character of the historic built environment. Without the windows in our historic buildings and the historic forms that they have preserved, the character of our built environment is very, very quickly degraded. An example like this shows you a largely complete late 18th century elevation, sort of commercial sort of setting, a house with a bank annex alongside. One can see little changes to the windows. Some of the sashes have got horns and so on. But fundamentally, the character and integrity of this elevation survives intact. And it's a very pleasing, harmonious thing to look at. Compare that with an example a few miles away. This would have been, though it's only workers' housing of maybe 1800 or so, this would have been quite a pleasing array with a regular rhythm of segmental arched windows on 3 stories, well, square heads to the top, a rhythm of doorways and windows alternating, and chimneys, of course, as well in the roof. And one can see how it has been pretty largely butchered by ill-proportioned and poorly detailed replacement windows. Not to mention the blocking up of the attics of a number of these houses and the removal of the chimneys. One wonders what goes on up there now. It looks like an enormous cannabis farm. I didn't knock. Let's think then about the use of windows. It's such a basic question that it perhaps seems needless to ask it. But what are windows for? Well, they're to let the light in, obviously. But they are also to distribute light. They are also, and we've got a casement in this example, concerned with ventilation and the control, more particularly, of ventilation. They let light in, but of course they also allow us to look out, and many windows will be contrived in such a way as to facilitate observation of a prospect, perhaps in a designed landscape, or surveillance in a more kind of formal and perhaps oppressive way of activities carried out by others. It's a way of regulating the temperature of the room, of course, as well. Or it becomes a way of regulating the temperature of the room once you have them. So there are all sorts of ways in which windows can be construed within a larger social environment. Ventilation is perhaps the least often thought of purpose of a window. We are intensely visual creatures, and we prioritize the visual sense over all others. But many windows are built primarily for ventilation. The light-giving qualities may be relatively minor. You could say that any building or interior space that generates a lot of heat or a lot of moisture will require a great deal of ventilation. If you're storing crops which have a moisture content which needs to be controlled to prevent mold and so forth, hay, grain preparatory to malting and so forth, you need ventilation much more than you need light, because you're not doing any very complex activities with these spaces. There are also windows which we know signify specific functions or activities within buildings, and we learn to recognize these patterns perhaps just from the outsides of buildings, so that we know where we are when we see them. And my examples here obviously are the large hall window at the upper end of a hall, here with a dais at Haddon Hall, or the diminutive, usually single light fire window, which we have associated with smoke-hooded hearths in the vernacular tradition. You need a fire window because the hearth itself is a relatively substantial working area taken off the main body of the kitchen or house body. We have windows which attract particular social activities. That my example on the left here has seats placed attractively at a sort of an angle to one another, not directly facing like in a railway carriage. And these might be spaces for religious devotions, for reading. If you remember the opening scene of Jane Eyre, there's that wonderful evocation of the private space behind the curtain in the window of a hostile household. And we will also find that that windows can be pressed out into the outside world in the form of bays or bows or oriels, and those start to confer a kind of greater reach to the sort of dweller within the building. You're letting more light in. You're also giving an enlarged prospect. So, an example like this at Strangers' Hall in Norwich, the oriel, conventionally we call them an oriel, though technically you might say this is simply a bay window, is a space within a space. And at their most enlarged and dramatic, it's virtually a room off a room. So it's a place where you can draw somebody in for an intimate conversation. It's about showing respect to a guest or a visitor within the otherwise relatively communal setting of the hall. And while we're on this sort of social theme, let's look at the way windows attract graffiti. Why do we make graffiti? I suppose self-memorialization is part of it. It's the pre-modern version of social media almost. It's those kind of comments that you might not sort of dare to speak in front of others, or activities you might not dare to perform in front of others, inscribed on the glass. And there we have Dr. Syntax, the early 19th century character in a quite hard to read poem these days, recording the wit of the window. Surveillance, well, I brought it up, so I should illustrate it. The example on the left, standing at a junction of two canals with its central bay window precisely placed to give you views up and down all the approaches to the what is presumed to be a canal offices there. And on the right, altogether different setting, but if you can see down here, there is a bay window, now unfortunately blinded by painted over glass, projecting out into what was an auction room for auctioning horses, riding horses, carriage horses, and possibly carriages as well. It's a late 19th century auction yard. Nor do these windows for surveillance pop up in the relatively recent past, that they have a very long history. A well-known building in Suffolk, which one can visit, Little Hall, has in the left-hand crosswing, in the return of that crosswing, if you can match the two images, the evidence here for a blocked up window. This is a sill running behind the present front of the hall. The hall is a secondary creation. There was an earlier hall with a wall set back behind the present one. And this little blocked window in the return of the crosswing would have looked sidelong across it and down the street, which is coming up a hill from the right here. So precisely what that means, we don't know. But somebody thought it worthwhile building in this window to get a view down that street up which people would approach to this house. Some of the fundamentals then. What are the main constituents of a window? Why do we have them, and how do they constrain the way in which windows are formed? Let's start with one of the most basic requirements. A window is to keep the weather out, or it has to keep the weather out as well as letting in light, let's put it that way. And it's not just keeping the weather out of the room behind, clearly, it's keeping weather out of the wall core, because you're creating an aperture in an otherwise solid wall with a facing of usually better quality stone and a more vulnerable core behind. We're talking about stone walling traditions. So the hood mould, the projection over the top of this window on the left is an effective way of throwing the water clear of the window, which lessens its impact on the sill below, which you also take trouble to cover over with as continuous a capping of stone or other suitably non-porous material as you can. So the hood mould has a very strong place in the Gothic and vernacular tradition. Later on, under the influence of classical ideas, it becomes seen as something of a redundancy, a Gothic excrescence, something that impairs the cleaner, more orderly, regular lines of a classical facade. So in my example on the right, you can perhaps see how the hood mould, once present, has been defaced. There's the top element, and here were the returned ends. You can see the different treatment of the stone there where it's been struck back. And this is a very regular occurrence that earlier buildings have their hood moulds defaced in the production of cleaner, often plastered or rendered exteriors. How do we bridge our window openings? If we don't bridge them, the wall falls down through them, so this is relatively important. We have a choice between arched or square heads. A square head extended beyond a limited distance needs intermediate support, so either mullions or tracery, and either form of window may need to have a relieving arch or may benefit from a relieving arch to distribute the weight to either side. My example on the right, taken from the inside of Bolton Castle, shows a further complication. We know that windows tend to be splayed. Have we got splays in here? I think we have, can't tell with all the curtains, which tend to distribute the light more evenly. but as you splay your window through thick walls, those early walls, then you increase the width of your opening. So we can see a transition here from a simple sort of slab window head on the exterior to an arch on the wider interior. Splays, as I say, they distribute light more evenly within a room, and on the plan on the left, you can see that the tendency, which we see so often that we hardly bother to think about it, for windows to be placed centrally on a wall. If they're the single window in a wall, they're usually placed centrally, and the splays are even on either sides to give you even illumination within the room. Any departure from that pattern is cause for thought. We may wonder whether something has happened to push somebody to another choice. As for example, here, in relation to the stair, we have a window that is off-centre. So if that stair had gone, that off-centre window is telling us something about the previous existence of something that pushed it to one side. My example on the right, not quite such a thick-walled building, but still one can see the effect of the splays. You have the wider internal rear arch, which has a different form from the external arch because it's bridging a wider space. So it's a more depressed form. And we can see there, one of the origins, I think, of the four-centred arch. Splays can also direct light in different directions from left and right. So dropping light down into basements. This is one of the earliest fully developed kitchen basements, service basements, with clearly very steeply shelving sills, in this case, to drop the light down. And we can also, though less commonly, direct the light up. Little turret room on the left at Oxborough Hall has 2 tiers of windows showing. The upper tier has been blocked, but you can see how the heads of those windows are shelving very steeply up. An unusual circumstance, but the image in the centre shows this rather delightful brick and plaster and paint star vault, which is being illuminated by that. It's a 15th century version of upcast lights to illuminate that vault. And we might think about other forms of directionality, so squints in churches and so forth. And then finally, thinking about the sort of physical properties of the opening, we need to think about the ways in which the connection is made, if you like, between the architectural void that surrounds that void and the glazing, the thing which is actually keeping the weather out, the glazing or shuttering, as we shall see. So mullions are at the same time supports for an extended window head, but they are also reducing the size of the lights, the individual openings, which one has to glaze. And that's important when we have relatively flexible leaded supports for glazing. And then within those, stanchions, timber or iron stanchions to stiffen the glazing, and sometimes saddle bars and other elements as well. Okay, next stage. How do windows develop over time? How am I doing for time? I think I'm just about all right. Conventionally, this has often been taught through the development of window tracery in medieval churches. But I think our emphasis is going to be much more domestic than ecclesiastical. I'll give you one reach back into the remote past. Saxon windows here, the double splayed form on the left, and a very rare surviving window board or shutter on the right. But thinking about medieval secular windows, I think one thing to emphasize is not only the variety of their forms, but their general conformity to the trend of ecclesiastical window design. So it is far from exceptional, provided you have the money to do it, for houses to be up to the fashion in the provision of traceried windows, for example. They may not, in the main, be the drivers of change. The great monastic and ecclesiastical interests are much better able to mobilize labour and skills to do that, but they are certainly not being left far behind. And perhaps the most characteristic example here is the one from Hadley in the centre, where the traceried heads are now severely degraded. They've been smashed out in the interests of getting more light in. And we have just the kind of the cusps and the periphery of those traceried heads. But complete examples are not that uncommon. We know, I'm sure, that the great majority of medieval domestic windows were unglazed. And any unglazed window, if the building is to have any degree of domestic comfort, has to be shuttered so that you can control the draft. There are various methods for shuttering, some better adapted to stone buildings, hinged shutter leaves, for example. Others, like the horizontally sliding shutter, which we see on the right, only really an effective solution for timber buildings. And one of the great advantages of the horizontally sliding shutter, you can't see the shutter, of course, they very rarely survive, but you've got the slot for it if the slide is bright enough for you to read it, and the slot should be twice the width of the window opening. So the full width of the shutter slides into the slot, or two leaves will slide to either side. The great advantage of timber shutters on timber rails, in timber slots, is that you can do them entirely with wood. You don't need to buy then still costly iron elements such as hinge pins, straps and nails. Another thing worth emphasising before we leave the medieval period, I think, is the really quite widespread use of elaborate window forms. I'm thinking particularly of oriel windows here, not the hall oriels now, but the true oriels on upper floors. Fine example here, they're invariably usually quite heavily restored. Here in conjunction with frieze windows, those sort of high-level windows just under the eaves or just under the next story, in this case, on a jetted building. And the nature of these oriel windows, while of course giving great presence and opulence to exteriors, is a little bit precarious, both mechanically and aesthetically. Mechanically, because they are prone to movement and to weather getting into joints and so forth. Aesthetically, because they fall foul of the same kind of hostility to Gothic excrescences in the late 17th, 18th, early 19th centuries. So for one reason or another, we have lost the great majority of these windows from our buildings, but they are not infrequently discoverable from external evidence, if not internal. Gaps in the timber frame are obviously important to this, but decisive things are mortices for attaching the oriels, and then either a deep multi-pegged sill large enough to corbel out, or some form of bracketed support there to actually carry the projection. We've already seen in that example how a taller window, the one before last, the Lavenham example, how a taller window calls for a transom to give structural stability to the jambs on either side. The higher your window goes, the more transoms you may need to maintain stability. And during the 16th century and into the 17th, indeed into the early 18th century, before they finally begin to be supplanted by more familiar sashed forms, we see a development of mullion and transom windows in stone, timber or brick, the brick usually plastered, as here, in a way that kind of defines an era, really, and it's beginning to codify this sort of classical language of architecture. So the big display fronts of the late 16th and early 17th century, like at Felbrigg or Hardwick, with their enormous arrays of windows. Sorry, there's a little Neil Kinnock moment there. Enormous arrays of windows give way to a much more disciplined, ordered array of regular mullion and transom windows, what Pevsner refers to as cross windows. And these, as I say, their sort of peak vogue is perhaps the middle and later 17th century, but they will carry on even in high status houses into the early 18th century. Just before we leave the 17th, little mention of closet windows. They're a good identifier for buildings, particularly of the later 17th and very early 18th century. These are the small, sometimes round or oval, sometimes just single light in an otherwise two-light array of windows, which marked the ends of the elevation and were usually set against end stacks. So they lit little closets at either end of the elevation. Sashes then, as I say, I'm going to say as little as possible in view of the contribution that's following mine about sashes, but I did want to show you this one, one of the earliest, possibly the earliest sash we have in the Royal Palace at Newmarket. Henty will correct me, I'm sure. But also to say that the progress of the sash is really quite slow in the early decades. They're expensive things. They are not suddenly proliferating here, there, and everywhere at all social levels. Indeed, the example on the right, this little sketch from a cartographer's records, shows that in many cases they were installed piecemeal. So 3 sashes is an indication that a house has been partially upgraded with sashes in the early 18th century, and that must have been quite a common phenomenon, I think. We're accustomed to look at the placing of the sash boxes in the plane of the wall, and that's very important. It obviously has a relationship to the London Building Acts, though not a very clear relationship, because those acts were only applicable within a very small radius of London, so that there is a lot to be said there, I think, on the impact of fashion on building design in provincial England. And within the 18th century tradition, one of the standout examples of windows is the Venetian window or Palladian window, this form with a central arched element and flanking narrower side lights, which carries with it a sort of freight of associations with imperial Rome, the Triumphal Arch, and so forth. It emerges in the 17th century, again, as quite a rarity, a signal device, and before the development of the sash window, so it's adapted to sashed fenestration later on. And it tends, because of its height, that arched opening in the middle, it's most suitable to high status buildings and tall internal spaces, which those buildings often provide. And stair halls is one obvious place to put it. In the Neo-Palladian and Neoclassical traditions, it's reserved really to strike an accent as on the pavilions at the end of this elevation. You see that kind of restraint, that kind of the effect that comes from varying an otherwise uniform and regular pattern, but varying it sparingly. It was much imitated and became very popular among a sort of aspirant class of merchants and professional men in 18th century England, and their approach to it was rather different, it's fair to say. It was, for them, I think, a signifier, perhaps a little bit like the stone refronting of the 1970s and 80s. It was a way of showing that you had a little bit of money to burn and that you belonged to a culture of taste, that very important sort of 18th century ticket to polite society. So they tend to be overused or used in extraordinarily ill-suited circumstances, or they are scaled down to fit. So you get some violent contortions of the type. And a student of mine sent me the example on the left. I can't claim it as an original find, but this is how far you can go if you have a postmodern sensibility. It makes much more sense on buildings of relatively moderate scale to do what Wyatt did in the late 18th century, and that is to use tripartite windows on the right there, also known as Wyatt windows, because by eliminating that arch, you solve the whole problem of how to make your window conformable to modest scaled interiors. And continuing down the social scale, this is something that has amused me once or twice recently. I think the OED's tilt window can probably be associated with this form, but that remains to be proven, I think. There aren't many references to it in the OED. It's basically a pivoting window, and as you can see from the example on the left, it will replicate the appearance of a sash superficially from the outside. You'll sometimes find these in stables with the top element pivoting in the manner of a later hopper light, perhaps, for ventilation. And I've included Dove Cottage, bottom right there. It's far off to the right in that funny little lean-to, and you have to disregard the violently diagonal window head, which I think must be an error, because the window turning in it does not have a diagonal head. But this is actually Dorothy Wordsworth's bedroom. So she had one of these pivoting windows in the early 19th century. And given that she's left us a journal with a wonderfully intimate account of living at Dove Cottage in the Lake District, it's a great pity that she didn't sit down one quiet winter's evening and describe the window in her bedroom. But I've been right through it and she doesn't. Shutters are an important part of window design in the 18th century. They are now for comfort and convenience and for security rather than to keep the wind out. And they derive essentially from the wainscot tradition that has been introduced in the 16th century. So usually panelled shutters, occasionally in very plain examples, plank shutters. And it's the internal ones that survive most often, but we do sometimes see external shutters. More often, perhaps, we find vestigial evidence for where external shutters have been lost. And my example on the right shows you some rather unsightly painted wooden blocks, anchor blocks, but also here and here, the ghosts of fixings for the little tiebacks, the little, as you can see, examples of, slightly different examples on the left. There is an association, I think, between external shutters and a kind of fear of the mob. There's a nice reference in John Galt's novel, The Provost, an early 19th century Scottish novel, to an order being given to the servants to secure the shutters when news of a mob gathering in the marketplace is reported to the house. More elaborate kinds of shutters tend to be the preserve of the country house and other very high status buildings. So the library at Holcombe Hall has these horizontally sliding shutters, a bit like horizontal sashes, of which I'm afraid I've said nothing. But working on the pocket door principle, so they come in and out of a slot, which has to be prefabricated in the wall. Or on the right, one of many rising or descending shutters rather than on the usual hinged fanfold or whatever principle. Thinking about the lower status elements of design, again, these kind of remnants of the bullseyes, as we call them, of traditional glass production, find their way into all sorts of low status, out of the way, out of sight places, including the way up to the lantern in St Paul's Cathedral, which I think was rather interesting, with some lovely big ovalo moulded glazing bars accompanying them. And coming right down, there is an element of industrial glazing, which I think is easily overlooked, and heaven knows how one conserves it to modern standards, but what is often referred to as lap glazing, where you eliminate the horizontal glazing bars and just retain the vertical ones, is a way of saving cost, I suppose. Speed perhaps might be part of it, but also using up, clearly in the example on the right side from a blacksmith's shop, of using waste glass, I can only imagine, broken remnants of glass. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the design of buildings has to take account of lighting in various other ways. It's not simply the window itself. So as plans deepen, the double pile, the triple pile in the later 17th century, you start to get a need for dropping light into areas of buildings that would not have faced you as a challenge when you had single pile ranges around courtyards. So the development of light wells is important, and other means of dropping light in. This depends on a technology capable of reliably keeping out the weather, of course, in exposed situations, but either boxed in light sources, as on the left, or a Sonian sort of moment of illumination dropping into an interior on the right, are ways of amplifying the effects of light within a building or solving very practical problems of illuminating inward spaces. And thinking about the development into the early 19th century, we start to see a dissolving of that boundary between interiors and exteriors. It's part of the picturesque landscape movement. This is a sown house in a Repton landscape, and you'll notice that the ground floor sashes come right down to the ground. The openings are framed by intervals in the veranda, and the sashes, though they are only sashes, they're not French windows here, rising up to the meeting rail, allow you, with a little bit of a stoop, to walk straight out into the garden. We're not meant to be talking about metal windows, and I've put one slide in, but it just makes the point that in the 19th century, after a long period in which wrought iron casements have figured as part of window design, the cast iron window makes its appearance and creates a new set of possibilities. These are perhaps most commonly associated with commercial buildings, as in the Liverpool chambers, commercial chambers on the left, and industrial buildings, shop fronts on the right, but they also make an appearance, of course, in domestic settings in a minority of cases. A few little points just to wind up. One is about the role of windows in creating pattern. As a rule, a building's elevation contains a number of windows, certainly the principal elevations, and how those windows are composed into patterns is an important element of our analysis and appreciation of buildings. In the Gothic or vernacular tradition, there is a prioritization of function and hierarchy in both the distribution and the scaling of the openings, which is very instructive. It means from the outside, in anything like a complete elevation like this, we can quickly identify the services to the left, the cross passage, the big hall window, and then the higher end accommodation to the right. In the classical tradition, especially what you might call the purist, most disciplined versions of it, the Neo-Palladian, the Neoclassical, it's about a more abstract and reasoned kind of sense of order. It is not devoid of expressions of social order. We have the piano nobile, the taller upper story above the rusticated basement. We have the smaller attic windows denoting lesser spaces. We have the Venetian windows pinpointing some key spaces in the building. But it is a much more abstracted sense of order than in the earlier tradition. And we can see too that there is a fluidity in the way in which this is interpreted. On this plan of Hatchlands, fine house in Surrey, if you look at the polite rooms, which are along these axes, you can see how the windows paired per room are symmetrically within each space. They also form a symmetrical elevation to the outside world. When you reach the service rooms down this long range, you find that the windows are sometimes irregularly placed in relation to the windows because they've been subordinated to the desire for a more regular external appearance. So there's a kind of prioritization of one over the other. And we see this too in the middling townhouse, that kind of approximation to classical design standards, which emerges in the later 17th century as a solution to building on a large scale in congested, expensive London. So we get this kind of shift of the elevation. It's no longer symmetrical. It's a pragmatic compromise with the sort of ideal classical forms, because a central entrance would render your front almost unusable. It would leave you with two very small, narrow rooms. So you push the entrance to one side, you pull the windows across in order to make them internally symmetrical. So various dodges and maneuvers, and then with the impact of time, those can be progressively varied, and we get something much more sort of heterodox as a result. This is originally a terrace of 4 houses with the coins at the far end, but now much disguised by rebuilding and refenestration. The importance of pattern is perhaps nowhere better expressed than in the inclusion of blind openings in order to maintain patterns. And that's perhaps most common on dual aspect corner sites where you end up with a redundancy of window openings in a relatively many windowed front. And interesting, the examples we've got here from the new town in Edinburgh also reproduce the insetting of the lower sash beneath the meeting rail, so that the sash is now part of the signification of the window. It's not simply the blind panel on the wall. Another example from Berwick on the left. And then pattern extending into the window opening itself. All sorts of delightful and interesting variations in glazing bar patterns. One imagines this was a way in which a joiner could excel, impress, and so forth. So Gothic examples there, also blind. And when we look at the comparison between the vernacular and the polite, well, what a difference. I've chosen my examples carefully, of course, to accentuate the difference, but the vernacular, high ratio of wall to window, the polite, particularly in the early 18th century, with a love of these sort of many-windowed, densely windowed fronts, this in an elevation that's been modified later in the 18th century. And the actual glazing patterns themselves, well, a lot of variety there too. The one on the left here, I can only call masonry pattern, and it's interesting that it absorbs the width of the mullions. It works across the mullions, so it's quite carefully worked out. Gothic pattern's very common, and the one on the right always strikes me as odd. This is very, very wrong, having landscape-shaped glass panes. But if anyone's from Scotland, they'll be very familiar with this. It's quite familiar there. And why would you not have landscape-shaped panes for looking out into the countryside, particularly at the period of the picturesque? But that's a connection that seems to have been lost on the English by and large. Change, rattle through this quickly to keep to time. Change is ubiquitous in windows because they are such an easy and relatively inexpensive way of upgrading your house and keeping it modern looking and a la mode. So alterations to windows. Here we've got the blocked window on the right and the window on the left, which had originally a similar form, but has had its sill dropped to get in taller mullions and lights, and you can see that in the surrounds. Here, mid to late 15th century building, the windows, the original windows denoted by stone relieving arches, and you might notice that on the first floor there, the stone relieving arches don't centre on the sash windows in those nice ashlar stone frames. When we go behind those two first floor windows, we get a very distinctive diagnostic situation where the splays are asymmetric. And what usually happens is that the wide splay reflects the original opening. The window has been widened on one side, and rather than match that splay, they've economized a little bit and pushed back to a slightly less sharply angled splay. So asymmetric splays are, unless there is a very good reason for directing light, a good reason for suspecting alteration. Mullion and transom windows do suffer very severely at the hands of the all-conquering sash in the 18th and early 19th century. So we frequently find, and it's partly because once you get down to the cross window form, the proportions are easily adaptable to a sash. So you can keep the frame and just install a sash within it. So 2 examples here, the one on the left, you can see a vestigial length of transom in those 2 mullions, trapped and the rest cut out. On the right-hand side, the tie bars here, tie blocks, I should say, are very familiar and don't necessarily imply a transom, but when you've got a redundant little block above, you know you're dealing with a removed transom, and sometimes you will find the stool or the head of a mullion that they've failed to dress back as well. So whenever you're looking at sash windows and you suspect that they might not possibly be original, it's worth looking a little bit further. Here we've got underneath the sill of the window these 2 little scrapes, arcs, clearly caused by something with operating on a radius from a fixed point above, 2 different fixed points. And the conclusion there is that the sash window must replace an earlier casement window, and it's the hanging stay. Can you see the similar scrape there left by the stay, which has had its impact? So our sash window on the left would have originated something like one or another of these types on the right. The flat-fronted 17th century form survives in some numbers. The more vernacular form that carried on well into the 18th century, quite how far I'm not sure, but perhaps to the middle of the 18th century, has been much more vulnerable and has been largely erased. Final thoughts then. I love this building. It has a sort of demonic vitality in its fenestration. It's a conservation officer's nightmare, I think. You know, what do you seek to protect here? What do you let go? But these are frontage houses, a pair originally, with workshops in the Birmingham jewellery industry behind, and those windows are recording the slow creep of the workshop and commercial elements into the frontage houses. So we've got multiple stages of change there, all being documented, like a little sort of mini biography in the windows. Very complex, but again, the form of the windows and the culture from which they emerge, the socialization of the window, have to be seen together. And there I will stop. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, you're fine, you're fine. Thank you, Adam, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. That's brilliant.